This is TWiT.
All right, I want to hear all about this. I'm going to be going to San Francisco here pretty soon, and I'm sure I'm going to see some of these taxis rolling around.
Robotaxis, interesting.
Robotaxis. My next company.
6 hours. 6 hours. That's how long it took for people to make their opinions heard and the California Public Utilities Commission to go ahead and say, hey, robotaxis, you can operate in San Francisco 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, despite the orange cones, despite the protests, and despite what I didn't learn until this morning, the unfortunate death of a dog. Robo-taxis are able to operate in San Francisco 24/7. Coming to the show to talk to us about this is the transportation editor at The Verge. It's Andrew J. Hawkins. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Before we kind of dig into things, let's lay this foundation. I was hoping you can describe this incident you wrote about where 10 cruise vehicles broke down in San Francisco that caused a traffic jam. Tell us about it and how these vehicles kind of what caused it and why it happened, and just how long after the agreement to let these vehicles operate did this take place?
Yeah, that was really the most significant part about all of this, was that it happened the next day after the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, voted to allow Cruise and Waymo, the two main companies testing robotaxis in San Francisco, to dramatically expand their services. They now have the ability to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can charge for their rides. They can go anywhere they want within the peninsula, the 7x7 as it's called in San Francisco. So the very next day after this vote, this dramatic vote handing these companies a huge victory, 10 cruise vehicles were stalled in the middle of an intersection outside of the music festival that was going on near the Presidio, the Outlands Music Festival. And Cruise said that the reason was because of an overloaded cellular network. There were so many people attending this music festival. They were all using their phones to hail Uber and Lyft rides, most likely, or call their friends. And those overloaded cell networks disabled these 10 vehicles, causing a huge traffic jam. So it's a sign that while they're having this unprecedented access now to the city of San Francisco, there are still a lot of technical issues that need to be worked out with how these cars operate, especially in dense urban environments like San Francisco.
Yeah, very clearly. And I'm curious, what was the decision that the California Public Utilities Commission made regarding these robotaxi services in San Francisco? And then, of course, I'd love to hear kind of how everybody reacted to this, because obviously this is something that they've been able to operate in some capacity leading up to this point. But to go 24/7, what all was involved in that? And then the reactions from people who were for it, against it, and everything in between.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a quirk in the California state law that you have this obscure state agency, the CPUC, that regulates a number of different industries. And they also regulate ride hailing, which is what these autonomous vehicle operators sort of are categorized underneath. And so they're the ones that get to decide, when do the companies get to start charging for their rides? How much can they do that for? Where can they operate? During what hours they have? So previously, for several years now, the companies were only allowed to operate at night. And there was also rules about, where they could operate, under what weather conditions, the speeds that they could operate on. They were only allowed to go under 35 miles per hour. They were only allowed to operate between like 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. So these were not busy time periods in which the companies were operating. So there was really not a lot of money to be made. And the companies obviously want to make money because they've been sinking billions and billions of dollars into this project over the number of years. So the commission held this hearing. I think it's important to note this is a hearing that they've delayed several times because of the outpouring of support and opposition and all of the various things that they needed to sort of pour over, all the data and the information that they had to pour over. So this hearing finally happened. As you noted, it was over 6 hours long, and they allowed public testimony. So it's basically anyone who wanted to come to San Francisco to this very dry state-run hearing could come and have their 5 minutes and say their piece about how they felt about all of these self-driving cars operating in their city. And I watched the whole thing, most of the thing. I took a few bathroom breaks, but I watched most of the hearing, and it was split pretty evenly between people who were very for it and people who were very against it. And you had a lot of compelling arguments on either side. You had people from the disability community, for example, who say that this is really, they have very limited mobility options and transportation options, and this would be something that could really help them get around a lot more easily if they had more of these self-driving cars. They had people who were Uber and Lyft drivers who said this is going to put them out of business. This is their livelihood. They drive for a living. And the idea of these driverless cars coming in and replacing them was a very disturbing thing to them. They were worried about their livelihoods. And you had people from, sort of the urbanist community who said, the answer is obviously not more cars, but it's more public transit, it's more walking, more biking, better infrastructure for these types of things. So there was a lot of opinions that were there. There's also a few cranks, people who are worried about, the self-driving cars, kidnapping them and things like that. But for the most part, it was a very evenly split kind of thing where hundreds and hundreds of people were testifying. And it was kind of difficult to see sort of which way that the commission would ultimately go if they were basing this on the public opinion. But ultimately, it was a 3-1 vote. They voted in favor of the companies, and they now have access to, they basically can operate as if they were a normal ride-hailing service like Uber and Lyft. They can operate at all hours of the day. They can charge money for their rides. They can go anywhere they want. They can go on highways. They can operate at any speed under any weather conditions. So I think now we're sort of looking to the companies to see how they're actually going to respond now to this vote, because the companies have been operating somewhat conservatively. I think that they realize that public opinion really kind of matters in how they roll this service out. So they're going to be somewhat, I think, cautious in how they choose to make the decision around expanding their services and whatnot.
Understood. Now, speaking of that, what companies are you aware of that are currently operating in San Francisco that now have this go-ahead? Are there many? Are there a few? What does the current state look like?
So there are dozens of companies that have been testing autonomous vehicles in California for a number of years now. But really, there are only 2 companies that offer passenger service. And one is Waymo, which is owned by Alphabet, which is obviously the parent company of Google. And Waymo is a spinoff of Google. And then you've got Cruise, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of General Motors, the automaker, the largest automaker in North America. So those are the 2 main companies. Both of those companies have hundreds of vehicles in San Francisco, and now they have the ability to add dozens more, even hundreds more if they so choose. And you also have a couple of other sort of smaller companies. There's Zoox, which is owned by Amazon. They've been testing some of their vehicles in San Francisco as well. And there's a few there's some delivery companies and many others. And then I think sort of, the most secretive of all of them is Apple. Apple has been sort of secretively testing its own self-driving cars, but we don't really know much about their technology or what they will end up doing with it.
Understood. Now, let's talk about the incidents. How have the incidents involving robotaxis kind of affected the public opinion and the enthusiasm that maybe some people had at first for these vehicles? And, you mentioned like a stuffed city like San Francisco versus when they're operating in Arizona. Like what problems does a city offer when it comes to driverless cars?
So it's obviously a much more complex environment. In the autonomous vehicle space, they talk about operational domain, where the cars are able to actually operate, and the operational domain for San Francisco is obviously much more complex than anywhere else that these cars are tested across the country. You have a number of obviously other human-driven vehicles, many of them. You have public buses, you have pedestrians, you have cyclists. You have very densely packed streets with cars that are parked and double parked and triple parked. You have bike lanes. You have construction zones. There's just a lot going on in a place like San Francisco. And as you can imagine, there have been a number of incidents that have come up over the past year or so in which these cars have been testing out, operated at night, but also testing during the day as well. They've blocked intersections. They've had a number of troubling encounters with emergency vehicles, with fire engines, with police vehicles, with ambulance services, with city buses, blocking city buses. And the thing about it all is that, in a world in which all cars are operated by humans, there are these types of incidents as well. Human drivers are mostly pretty terrible at driving, and they block other vehicles, and they get into car crashes, and they're distracted, and people drive drunk, and there are accidents. These cars are sort of held up as an antidote to all of that. These are the cars that don't get distracted. They don't get drunk. They operate by under the speed limit, and they follow all the rules. They drive sort of like your grandmother might drive, very conservatively. But that said, they still have technical difficulties at times. Whether it's this incident with the 10 cars getting stuck because of an overloaded cell network, or whether it's just they get confused by a certain scenario because there's a police situation going on, and they've got an intersection roped off, and they just don't know how to act. And so the company's argument is that, like, we haven't killed anybody, we haven't hit anybody, we've gotten involved in very few accidents. There's been minor incidents, and the thing is, we learn from each of these incidents. We take that data, we feed it back into our algorithm, we use it to train our machine learning programs, and then we spit it back out to our fleet, and the fleet is then updated and knows how to operate because it's encountered these edge cases, these very sort of very rare sorts of instances that happen. But that said, those still get a lot of attention, they get a lot of focus, and they make people very upset, especially when it involves things like transit and emergency vehicles. So it's something that the companies really need to address better, and I think they recognize that. But it's not clear that the public is really going to suddenly fall in love with these vehicles if these types of things keep happening.
Understood. And then I guess, are these companies planning, despite everything that's going on? I mean, they did secure a win here. Does this mean that they're planning on expanding to other cities? And what, if so, kind of how are those cities preparing or not preparing for this? I just imagine some cities might be like, oh God, they might be coming here next. What do we do? Or are other cities kind of welcoming this, or is it kind of a mixed bag?
Yeah, so it's really on a state-by-state kind of basis, I think. The companies have said that they are obviously interested in expanding to other cities. They need to in order to continue to operate. If they don't start making money soon, you can very well see that their parent companies are going to eventually, cut their losses and shut things down. It's happened before. There have been autonomous vehicle operators that have shut down because, for example, Argo last year shut down after Ford and Volkswagen both pulled their funding out and said, you know what, this is taking too long. We don't want to be so heavily invested in this technology. We'll just let others operate, and lose money on it. And that's what's been happening. GM's been losing over $1 billion every year on this project. Google as well, losing billions of dollars on this. So they need to start bringing cash back into the operation. So it's imperative that they expand to other cities. So Waymo is planning on launching a robotaxi service in Los Angeles. Both companies are testing their vehicles in Austin, Texas, and plan on launching services there as well. Waymo obviously is already in Phoenix, as you mentioned, and has been there for a number of years now, operating ride-hailing services. And I know that they have a number of other localities. Miami is being looked at as a possible location. And there's even here in New York City, a few Waymo vehicles have been seen testing their and mapping the streets, being driven by humans, manually operated vehicles. But when you're mapping the streets of a city, it seems to be a precursor for potentially a commercial service down the line. So there's a lot of pressure. These companies are under a lot of pressure to not only get the technology right, but to start having some, bringing in some customers, spreading to other cities and commercializing their services. So I think we're going to start to see a lot of activity over the next year or so. I think the California example is being held up as what can happen even under a very strict regulatory environment. California obviously has a lot of rules about how these vehicles can operate. There's obviously states that don't have as many rules. Arizona basically has said you can just do whatever you want. Don't worry about it as long as you don't kill anybody, which they did many years ago. That was an Uber vehicle, and then now Uber doesn't have a self-driving car program anymore. But there's pros and cons to having all of these rules. But I think the industry sees the win in California as a positive sign for growth in the future.
Understood. And one last question for you. There's obviously this mixed reaction. You've got some positives, some negatives, some in-betweens, and then you've got technical issues and regulatory hurdles. As a transportation editor who's been looking at this for so long, kind of crystal ball prediction, what do you think is the future of autonomous vehicles in general? Will we see, in your opinion, kind of a growth in this area and a reduction in the vehicles that we drive ourselves? Or do you see it going more the way of public transit? If you had to guess, what do you think is next?
Yeah, so I've ridden in a number of these vehicles. I was actually in San Francisco last month, and my wife and I took a cruise vehicle. We went and got some dinner, and then we went and got some dessert afterwards, and it worked. It worked fine. There were no incidents. It drove very slowly, but it got us where we needed to go. It wasn't convenient. We had to walk to our location afterwards because it was outside the service area. It took a long time for the car to come. So I think that there's a lot of limitations that these companies are operating under right now that make it so that the services that they're offering, while for the most part are fine and good, are not convenient. And they're sort of a curiosity. I think a lot of people use them as there's a lot of potential, I think, for a lot of tourist interest in these. If you are visiting San Francisco as a tourist, take a robotaxi, that has a lot of potential, I think. But as a competitor to a human operated service like Uber and Lyft, it's not there yet. And I don't know when it will get there. I think it'll take more cars. It'll take a lot more innovation. It'll take a lot of improvements in the system to get there. So I don't know if they can just flip a switch and make this into a profitable system, because as of today, as I mentioned, losing a ton of money, and if they don't start to show a meaningful return on those investments, a meaningful line of revenue for companies like Alphabet and GM, which obviously has a lot of irons in the fire at the moment. GM shifting to electric vehicles. Google has an existential threat that it's facing with AI, generative AI. There's a lot going on, and they can't really afford to continue spending so much money on this project. So I think that they're going to want to start to see whether or not these services can be actually commercialized, or whether it's just going to be some sort of fad or a tourist attraction, at which point they will probably cut their losses. As for personally owned vehicles, GM has said unequivocally that we're going to start selling vehicles to people with autonomous features by the middle part of this decade. So that's in 2 years from now, that they have claimed that's a goal of theirs to do. I don't know if they're going to be able to live up to that goal necessarily. I think that there's a lot of potential in partial autonomy. So things like driver assist systems like Tesla's Autopilot or GM's Super Cruise, things where you can use it on the highway or you can have hands-free driving. I think there's some potential there. But as far as like a fully autonomous robotaxi with no steering wheel, no pedals, and you can maybe cram a couple of people into a vehicle, I think we need to see a lot more activity and a lot more proof from these companies that this is going to be something that they can commercialize a lot faster. Otherwise, I think it's going to get stuck in second gear, and I don't see it getting out of it.
Understood. Well, Andrew, I want to thank you so much for your time today coming to explain all of this. It's very complicated, but particularly like what we talked about with the regulatory hurdles and everything in between. And I'm curious to see how this goes going forward, if we're going to see more orange cone protests and all of that jazz. But of course, folks can head over to theverge.com to stay up to date with what you are writing about. Is there anywhere else they should go online to be able to follow you and keep up with your work?
No, The Verge is the place where I do all my publishing. So that's where they can go, theverge.com/transportation. And I appreciate you guys having me on. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
Tech Break is brought to you by ACI Learning. Keep your team's IT skills current. Visit go.acilearning.com/twit. Twit listeners will receive at least 20% off or as much as 65% off an IT Pro Enterprise Solution Plan. The discount's based on the size of your team when you fill out their form.